Lieutenant Victor Ketterer, MC, 16 Battalion AIF. First to last and then some. Before I launch into that, I should explain why I'm talking about Lieutenant Ketterer, MC, 16 Battalion. And the reason is that some 10 years ago, I sat down and I looked at the embarkation list of the people from 16 Battalion and the 1st and 2nd reinforcements who all joined together in Egypt. And I wondered to myself, what happened to them? And the reason I asked myself that question was that I had looked at a book on another battalion, an Eastern States battalion, that departed with roughly 1,000 men and 150 reinforcements. And they landed at Anzac. And on the 11th of November 1918, they had a photograph taken of the people who were still serving with that battalion from the landing to the armistice. How many people were in the photograph? There were 14 people in the photograph. Now, why were there only 14? Some had been killed, some had been wounded, not recovered, sent home. Some had played up and done naughty things and been dismissed the service. Some of them had refused to be vaccinated on the trip from Sydney. They said they didn't want smallpox vaccination. There was no way in the world they were going to have it. So the ships landed at Fremantle and they were told, go home. By the way, give us back your uniform. You look nice in your underwear. But then the units slowly broke up into smaller parts. When they departed, there were 2 maximum machine guns and basically 2 main operators for the machine guns. And then at the end of Gallipoli, they formed machine gun companies, then later machine gun battalions. One of the 16 Battalion machine gunners started out as a private soldier. He finished up as a lieutenant colonel. He commanded a battalion of machine guns. He had under his command 64 Vickers machine guns, which is one hell of a lot of machine guns to have under command. In addition to that, people went off and formed Stokes mortar companies. One of my great uncles was in a Stokes mortar company. They were the shoot and scoot people. They would come in and they could get about 12 bombs into the air and then get the hell out of it before the German counter-battery people worked out that they were there and brought counter-battery fire onto them. So that was the sort of basis from which I sat down and looked at all these people from 16 Battalion, and I thought, I'll never do it. And I started to go through it and I became incredibly distracted because literally I did learn about machine gun battalions and I did learn about Stokes mortars, and 16 Battalion of course also contributed to at the Battle of Bullecourt, a great number of prisoners who became prisoners of respite. Nowadays we'd call them hostages. One of those was another of my great uncles, and he spent nearly 6 months in Fort Macdonald. Nobody knew where he was. He wasn't notified to the Red Cross. And then finally he got out and went to Limburg and went off and cut down trees in Poland. So I looked at all this, and every time I started to get into it, I found more interesting things that looking at the whole thing. I just didn't want to write down KIA and that, because then I discovered that some people came back, and one man had made it to joined as a private, made it to the rank of captain, was decorated with a military cross, took all his deferred pay, and got a grant of land up near Bruce Rock, and tried to become a farmer. He didn't have any background in farming. Needless to say, it failed. But he had an advance from the Agricultural Bank of WA on a crop that would never happen, and it was all too much for him. So he went out and drank a bottle of sheep dip. And there were other men who had lost arms, and they were trained to be, they could apply, and they did apply to become school teachers, primary school teachers. And then they were sent out, way the hell out into the bush, to one-teacher schools where they lived in a little house on their own, and the kids called them Wingy or Stumpy. It was a horrible life for them, and believe it or not, one of the highest rates of suicide was in primary school teachers who'd been trained because they'd lost a limb. So I got into all sorts of things, and then I came across Victor Ketterer. So with those few words, I will now like to introduce to you Victor Ambrose Ketterer, Military Cross, 16 Battalion, and the title of my talk is First to Last and Then Some. On the 12th of November 1918, Victor Ambrose Ketterer, who was an engineer at that time, was enlisted into the AIF at Helena Vale Depot. According to an interview given by his stepdaughter in 1967, this was his fourth attempt to enlist in the AIF. His previous attempts had been unsuccessful as he was too short. He made his successful attempt by wearing special shoes and elevating himself within those and packing them with newspaper, and he achieved a recorded height of 5 foot and 4 inches. With that height, he was duly sworn to serve in the war, for the duration of the war, and for 4 months unless discharged earlier. The matter of his height was the first of the number of matters that made Victor unique amongst his peers. 2 officers with their arms linked and Victor standing between them, and he fails to come up to their armpits. And I have a reference to the official standards. He went to basic training. He was assigned to number 3 Depot Company at Black Boy Hill and completed his rudimentary training, and then he was assigned to the 2nd Reinforcements of 16 Battalion with the regimental number 1490. He remained on the nominal roll of the unit for the remainder of the war, other than for periods in hospital. The 2nd Reinforcement sailed from Fremantle aboard HMAT A50 Itonis on the 22nd of February 1915, directly for the Middle East. They arrived not long after the original battalion, which had sailed from Fremantle to Melbourne, where 4 Brigade, of which 16 Battalion was a member, was concentrated for training and embarkation for the Middle East via the first convoy. I'd like to now turn back the clock to see what allowed Private Ketterer to make it onto that troop carrier. The family history was very interesting. Victor's father's name was Andreas Ketterer, better known, the anglicised version, as Andrew. He had been born in Baden-Baden, Germany in 1836. He arrived in Victoria aboard the sailing ship the Göttingen on October 1857. Victor's mother, Elizabeth, had been born in Birmingham, and she arrived in Victoria at the age of 2 years. Andreas, or Andrew, aged 31, married Elizabeth, then aged 16 years, in 1867. The couple were exceedingly fertile. The first child was born later in 1867. There were a further 7 born before the birth of Victor Ambrose Ketterer in 1883. At the time of his birth, 3 of his elder siblings had died. On the 18th of April 1887, Andrew Ketterer died from pneumonia, and 2 weeks later his wife was delivered of their 11th child. Elizabeth Ketterer was now a 36-year-old widow with a responsibility for caring for 4 children under the age of 7 years. She was in dire straits, to say the least, as there was no social welfare system to give her relief. Exactly what she did and where she went is not documented. The family would love to know, and so would I. But it seems that she did for some time run a boarding house on the North Queensland goldfields. How she survived and what hardships she endured are undocumented, but they must have been considerable. As Elizabeth Ketterer forged a life for herself and her dependent children, she must have set a significant example for his son. Sometime prior to 1914, she entered into a domestic relationship with a Mr. Turner, as when Victor had to state his next of kin on his enlistment form, he quoted his mother as Mrs. Turner. Now, this can have only been a common law marriage, as extensive searching of all the public records of Australia have failed to identify such a marriage. On enlistment, he made his mother his next of kin, care of his sister in Kalgoorlie. At first, it was felt that Mrs. Turner must have really been in Kalgoorlie, but she could not be identified from any electoral roll or any other public document at that time. It is now not even known where or when she died and under what name. The family has researched it, and they believe that her final resting place is Mount Gravatt in Brisbane. The life story of Elizabeth would be a great story by itself. At the time of the formation of the AIF, the Australian Army was quite particular about who could be your next of kin. If the father was alive, in the case of single men, then he was automatically the next of kin. After that came the mother, and then there was a laid down precedence. When he enlisted, Victor may not have been sure of his mother's address, and there are also doubts about her level of literacy. He probably didn't want to draw attention to himself, so he did the honest thing and nominated his mother, but he nominated her at the address of his sister, Jane, who was known as Mrs. Baldock, and Victor also lodged a will with Mrs. Baldock in Kalgoorlie. When the Army wrote to Mrs. Turner, and that's Elizabeth, in 1915, they got the sister's name wrong and called her Mrs. Bullock. The records show a typed letter correcting the error, and it's unusual to see a typed letter in records from that type. And on the bottom is written Mrs. E. Turner, and whether that was her or whether it was his sister, we don't know. Victor had complied with the Army requirement of having his closest relative as his next of kin, but he was a trifle underhand in that he really nominated his sister. He travelled to Europe. At some time, and when is complete unknown, Victor Ketterer travelled to Europe. It is not known if he visited his mother's relatives in England at Birmingham. It seems quite likely that he saw the Ketterer side of the family in Germany. The Port of Fremantle records show that he arrived as a third-class passenger aboard the GMS York. I can't say the German word, but York it'll have to do, on the 14th of August 1908, having boarded the vessel in Antwerp. The shipping notices recorded that the York was outward bound from Bremen via ports. The master's log showed that after leaving Bremen, the ship called at Antwerp, Southampton, Genoa, Port Said, before berthing at Fremantle. This raises the question of why Victor was in Europe, how long he spent there, and finally his level of understanding of the German language. On arrival in Fremantle, he stated his nationality as British, which was quite correct, as he'd been born in the colony of Victoria. The majority of the passengers on that vessel were German, and they all stated their nationality as Germans. Having landed in Fremantle, he joined the other members of his family in Kalgoorlie. The electoral roll shows that he lives apart from the other family members, but it seems that there was quite a nucleus of the family in that city. Passing on to Egypt, 1914, a picture of Victor. On arrival in Egypt, they were absorbed into the battalion to replace men who had been returned to Australia for disciplinary reasons or found to be underage, medically unfit. They were continuing sick or had died on the voyage. It's amazing the number of people who died at sea. 8 of the original battalion members had been discharged in Albany, having refused to be vaccinated. The battalion had been reorganised on arrival in Egypt, and the 8 companies, each of 2 platoons, were now formed into 4 companies, each of 4 platoons. There was still a temporary excess of soldiers, and these were held together in a pool under the command of Lieutenant Brashaw. Training continued with emphasis on long marches and battalion-sized deployments around the camp at Heliopolis. The battalion was divided into 3 parts on the 11th of April 1915 and left Cairo for Alexandria. Headquarters and 3 companies joined the German prize ship, the Hyder Pasha, for the journey of 650 nautical miles to the harbour of Mudras on the island of Lemnos, which was reached on the evening of the 15th of April 1915. The Hyder Pasha entered the harbour on the 16th of April, and for the next 3 days the battalion practised entering the ship's boats while wearing full marching kit. The Hyder Pasha, with 16 battalion aboard, sailed from Mudras for Gallipoli around noon on Anzac Day, the 25th of April. The objective was reached at 4 in the afternoon. The journey of 60 nautical miles had taken some 4 hours. The Anzac landing had then been in progress for roughly 4 hours, and the commanders ashore were beginning to doubt the wisdom of committing more troops to action, as it seemed to have all the hallmarks of a disaster. The first 16 battalion troops to go ashore at the landing were the reinforcements under the command of Lieutenant Brashaw. That included Private Ketterer. They then acted as a beach working party and didn't return until the battalion proper until the 2nd of May 1915. At that time, 16 Battalion, as the lead element of 4 Brigade, starting towards the shore, a series of meetings was being held to determine whether or not there should be an attempt or there should be retirement and withdrawal. It was felt that with the new dawn and the application of heavy artillery and strong pressure from the Turkish army would result in an Anzac front line crumbling, resulting in a complete rout. It was after midnight before the final decision was made to stay and fight. By that time, all of 16 Battalion, including Ketterer, were ashore. The remaining troops went ashore and were immediately deployed to Monash Gully, where they came under heavy fire. They remained closely engaged with the enemy until the 30th of April 1915, before being relieved by 15 Battalion. At all times, they remained under observation by Turkish snipers. Between the 30th of April and the 2nd of May, 16 Battalion lost 50 men, either killed or wounded due to sniper fire. Obviously a very dangerous place. The first battle honour awarded to 16 Battalion was landing at Anzac, and Private Ketterer was present at that action for which the honour was awarded. The first time 16 Battalion went into an offensive action was on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of May. The battalion was engaged in an offensive action at the Bloody Angle around Quinn's Post. Action started around 19:30 hours on the 2nd of May. Overnight, they suffered a great number of casualties, and they made some temporary gains, but by 1300 hours the next day, on the 3rd of May, they'd given them up. In this action, Private Ketterer was lightly wounded in the thigh, and he was moved to a casualty clearing station at Anzac Cove, where he was treated and then evacuated by ship. He remained on the medical roll until the 17th of May, when he returned to duty. The action at Bloody Angle resulted in the loss of 8 officers and 330 other ranks not accounted for as killed, wounded, missing. The roll call at the conclusion of the action showed only 9 officers and 298 other ranks available for duty. There were insufficient personnel to maintain a 4-company structure, so they were reorganised into an A company and a D company, and 4 and 126, and 2 officers and 117 in the other. The headquarters and the machine gun element accounted for the other 3 and 55. And total casualties suffered in the period the 25th of April 1915 to the 4th of May were 20 officers and 668 other ranks killed, wounded, missing or evacuated for other reasons. The next phase of the operation was strong offensive action against Turkish forces on the night of the 18th of May. In this action, some 4 Turkish divisions numbering around 42,000 men were deployed against the Allied lines. They were manning Quinn's Post during the offensive, and they inflicted great casualties on the attacking troops. The dead lay in piles in front of their lines, and on the 20th of May 1915, an unofficial truce was declared, and for the purpose of collecting the wounded. And following this unofficial truce, action resumed. I've never understood the difference between an official and an unofficial truce. They're both truce. It tricks me. On the 24th of May, there was an official truce for the purpose of collecting and burying the dead. General Birdwood gave the specific orders that the tallest and strongest looking soldiers were to be detailed for this particularly gruesome task, as he wished to gain some psychological advantage over the opposition. And it can be reasonably assumed that a midget man of such small stature as Private Ketterer would not have been detailed for that particular fatigue. The battalion remained in the front line until the 1st of June and was withdrawn to a rest gully for fatigues. they left Gallipoli for a while. After 5 weeks of fatigue duty, the battalion was withdrawn for a short rest on the island of Imbros, and the rest period was exceedingly short and lasted from only the 5th of July to the 10th of July, when they returned to the peninsula. On page 27 of his recollections, Victor Ketterer describes the departure from Watson's Pier at around 1700 hours and the Turkish attempt to sink the barges with artillery fire. He records that the Turks lobbed 32 shells at them, but fails to provide any description of the time they spent on the island. When the battalion returned to the peninsula, Private Ketterer was promoted to corporal with the effective date of the 19th of July 1915, and the unit remained in reserve until the 6th of August, when it was committed to the last great offensive of the Peninsular Campaign. Starting on the night of 6th to 7th of August, the 4th Brigade, under the command of John Monash, demonstrated towards Hill 971. The attack failed with heavy casualties, but some ground gained. And the battalion casualties for the night were killed in action 2 and 22, and wounded 3 and 42, making a total of 5 officers and 64 men in a single night. The advanced lines could not be held, and there was a withdrawal on the 8th of August 1915 under the cover of battalion machine guns. A further 4 officers and 114 other ranks were injured during the withdrawal. During the ferocious action of the 6th, 7th and 8th of August, Corporal Ketterer came under particular notice, for which he was mentioned in dispatches. In the reorganisation that followed the action, he was promoted to sergeant with effect from the 10th of August. The MID was formally notified in the London Gazette on the 28th of January 1916, and it lists him as a corporal, which was the rank he wore at the time he was received the mention. For the actions on the 6th to the 8th of April, the battalion was awarded the Battle Honours Saribert, and Corporal Ketterer was present during the action resulting in that honour. When the unit went into action in August 1915, it was able to muster approximately 900 men. Between 6th of August and 13th of September, the effective fighting force had dwindled down to a total of just 200 men, all ranks. Battle casualties, together with non-battle casualties, contributed to the collapse of the fighting strength. The non-battle casualties were mostly diarrhoea and dysentery, which was terrible. On the 13th of September, the remnants of 16 were shipped to Lemnos for a rest. They received reinforcements and additional training. Great. Victor Ketterer has written about this these times in pages 28 and 29 of his recollections. His description of tinned meat and jam available on Gallipoli and the island is recognised in the text of the Old 16th, written by Captain Longmore. The unit returned to the peninsula on the 2nd of November. On returning, the unit began to prepare underground accommodation to protect themselves against the winter, which had begun to close in. The problems of defending Gallipoli during winter months had been discussed at all levels, up to and including the War Cabinet in London after September 1915. Lord Kitchener was directed to make a personal survey, and he came ashore from the 12th to the 14th of November. The decision to evacuate Gallipoli was made on the 23rd of November 1915. There was recognition that the greatest risk during the retirement would be silence. In order to acquaint the Turks with silence, a policy of no firing and small arms artillery was introduced on the 24th of November. On several occasions, the Turks attempted to enter the front line, and they were beaten off very quickly. The silence stunt finished on the 27th of November, and the Turks were confused, but it was felt that they'd come to the conclusion that troops were carrying out winter preparations without hindrance of fighting. The first freezing day was the 29th of November 1915, and on that day it was found that the water in the cooling jackets of the Vickers had frozen. Snow began to fall in December. For the bulk of the members of the AIF present on Gallipoli, that was their first experience of snow. The change in the weather was accompanied by a change in the pattern of disease. Whereas previously the main problem had been diarrhoea and dysentery, the onset of cool weather caused an outbreak of jaundice. Although serological testing did not exist at that time, it was almost certainly hepatitis A. Sergeant Ketterer developed jaundice and was taken aboard a hospital ship, the Oxfordshire, on the 12th of December 1915 and transferred to No. 3 Auxiliary Hospital at Heliopolis. The jaundiced Sergeant Ketterer was medically evacuated just 6 days before 16 Battalion began its withdrawal from Gallipoli. The unit was withdrawn over 3 days, and the last of the members left the beach of Anzac Cove at 0250 hours on the 20th of December. After a brief stop in Lemnos, they continued on to Alexandria, where they disembarked on the 29th of December. The Gallipoli summary then is Victor Ketterer had been present and landed on Anzac Day, about 12 hours after the initial assault. He left the peninsula because of wounds for a period of 14 days, then because of sickness for a period of 6 days. He accompanied the unit in both planned rest periods off the peninsula while they absorbed reinforcements and regained fitness. During the period April to December 1915, he had been promoted from private to corporal, then to sergeant, and been mentioned in dispatches. This was an outstanding record of service in Australia's first great campaign, and he was truly an original Anzac. In later years, he would be entitled to a brass A on his colour patch, and that accounts for the words first in the title of my talk. Following his illness and jaundice, Sergeant Ketterer rejoined 16 Battalion on the 17th of February 1916. At the time, reinforcements were pouring into Egypt, and it was decided to raise additional divisions. The following is extracted from the story of a battalion being a record of the 48th Battalion AIF by W. Devine, and I quote, "On the 3rd of March 1916, 4 officers and 350 other ranks from 16 Battalion were marched from the parade ground under the command of Major R.L. Lean to create the nucleus of 48 Battalion. Sergeant Ketterer remained with the parent battalion. The battalion was then engaged in preparation for a move to the Western Front. On the first anniversary of Anzac Day, there was a 4th Division Sports Day in which 16 Battalion participated. While the sports were in progress, some soldiers broke into the private liquor supply of Major General H.V. Cox, the newly appointed divisional commander, and later the Indian Army. Cox was not amused by this diversion, and he had a routine order published and read to all troops for 3 days in a row, in which he threatened the death penalty for anyone who stole liquor from his personal supply. He was obviously unaware of the Australian Defence Act 1903, which would have required the personal signature of the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, acting on the advice of the Executive Council of Australia before he could carry out his threat. The battalion departed the port of Alexandria aboard SS Canada on the 1st of June 1916 and disembarked at Marseille on the 7th of June 1916 and then moved by rail to northern France. The first elements of the battalion were introduced to trench warfare on the 20th of June 1916, and on the 27th, the complete battalion entered the combat zone in support of 13 and 14 battalions. This was the first time that the battalion had been on frontline duty in 8 months. Now, I do not intend to repeat the progression of the battalion on the Western Front, as that is a talk entirely of its own right, and my voice would give out. What I do want to do is list the battle honours awarded to 16 Battalion on the Western Front, and they were Pozières, Bullecourt, Messines 1917, Ypres 1917, Polygon Wood, Hamel, Amiens and Hindenburg Line. Ketterer was present at every one of those actions. As the battalion fought through the Western Front, Ketterer was promoted to Warrant Officer Class 2 on the 24th of August 1916. He was commissioned in the field on the 8th of February 1917 as a second lieutenant and promoted to full lieutenant on the 31st of October 1917. Whilst serving as a company sergeant major, he had been mentioned in dispatches for a second time. He was wounded in the right forearm on the 30th of August, but was able to rejoin the unit the following day. Throughout his time on the Western Front, he had only 3 periods of recreational leave, and they were the 23rd of September to the 12th of October in 17, a period of 19 days, 7th of December 17 to 29 December 17, 22 days, 1st of March 1918 to 10 March 18, a period of 9 days. So in his time on the Western Front, he had a grand total of 50 days leave. Between the 4th of June and the 8th of August, he was absent with pneumonia, and part of the recovery period was spent at a hospital in London, the 3rd General Hospital. It is significant to note that Lieutenant Ketterer never attended a single course of instruction for promotion, commissioning, or school of instruction. I pass on to the last fight and decoration. The 16th Battalion entered what was to be its last battle on the 18th, 19th of September 1918 with the objective of capturing the town of Le Verger. This formed part of the Hindenburg Line and proved to be a very difficult item to capture. It was in this action that Lieutenant Ketterer received his military cross. The citation says it all, and I'm afraid I have to read you the entire citation. By 1918, most citations for things like the military cross and the DCM were about 3 lines. This is a bit longer, which shows that somebody really put some thought into it. For gallantry and initiative as intelligence officer on 18th September 1918, when an attack was being made on Le Verger, northwest of St. Quentin, he personally placed the jumping off tapes and subsequently supervised the placing of the infantry on their jumping off positions. During the attack, he kept in touch with progress of the attack and kept the battalion headquarters informed thereof. While doing so, he located an enemy machine gun which had been missed by our troops and was firing into the backs of the leading companies. He immediately attacked the position with the aid of his runner, succeeded in capturing the gun, killing 2 and taking 3 of the crew prisoner. Throughout, he showed the greatest initiative and maintained an exceedingly high standard of gallantry, promulgated in the Commonwealth of Australia Gazette on the 20th of November 1919. The battalion was then withdrawn from the line for rest and reinforcements, and due to the armistice, never returned to active duty again. If I can just summarise the Western Front for Victor. In the period of July 16 to September 18, Victor Ketterer was promoted from Sergeant to Warrant Officer Class 2, wounded, mentioned in dispatches for the second time. He was commissioned in the field and later promoted to Lieutenant. He fought in the very last action on the very last day that the unit fought in the war. On that day, he was awarded the Military Cross, and this comprises the words, "the last" in my title, as you can see on the slide. As the rest of the battalion took a well-earned rest, Lieutenant Ketterer was transferred to the Army of the United States of America. Small numbers of Australian officers and NCOs were transferred into units from the USA as they began to filter into the lines to take over fighting from the British and French forces. Lieutenant Ketterer was detached from 16 Battalion on 25th of September and returned on the 2nd of October. He served in the 27th Infantry Division and in particular with the 105 Infantry Regiment as part of that division. The regiment in which he served assaulted the Hindenburg Line during the period that he was acting with their company commander. The war ended quite abruptly on the 11th of November 1918, and by various stages the 4th Brigade became concentrated at Fresny-le-Grand. On the 16th of November 1918, Chaplain Harper conducted a Thanksgiving and memorial service. At that time, it was believed that the AIF would contribute forces to the occupation of Germany along the Rhine, although this never happened. There were to be further movements on the 26th of November 18, and the battalion reached its final billets at Sens du Nord on the 26th of November. Lieutenant Ketterer left France and crossed to the AIF command depot at Sutton-Verney, where after absolute minimum time and administrative effort, he was transferred onto HMAT Manami, which sailed for Australia on the 21st of December 1918. The troops aboard the Manami disembarked at the port of Fremantle on the 27th of January 1918. Victor had been absent from Australia for 1 month, short of 4 years. Following 2 months' leave, his appointment in the AIF was terminated on the 28th of March 1919. I need to comment on his post-war period. In the post-war, the available records show that he first went to reside at 993 Wellington Street, West Perth, which was a pleasant and quite smart address at that time. After his discharge from the army, Victor went to work for the Repatriation Department and remained in that employment until his death. On the 5th of November 1921, he married Elsie K. Foster, Now, Elsie was the widow of 3079 Sergeant Robert Samuel Foster, who'd served in 48 Battalion and been killed in action on the 6th of August 1916 at Pozieres. He has no known grave. The Fosters had been married in Sydney on the 18th of December 1911, and they had a single female child, Doree, and as a couple, Victor and Elsie had no children of their own. Doree did have a lad, and he was raised basically as Victor's stepson. The Ketterer family went to live in the outer suburb of Nedlands. They built a house at 28 Cooper Street. The house is still standing and probably looks much as it did then. Research at the Nedlands City Council shows only an application from the then owner to erect a shed in the mid-1980s. Victor Ketterer was very active in the RSL and was the president of the Nedlands sub-branch. He also headed the 16 Battalion 4 Brigade Old Comrades Association. He was also active in the historical side of 16 Battalion and is mentioned as the secretary of the History Committee by Longmore in his 1929 publication, The Old 16th. Victor Ketterer wrote out a number of anecdotes in handwriting for Longmore and later modified these in typewriting. Much of what he wrote is recognisable either in part or full in the unit's unofficial history. Some 4 years after his death, these papers were forwarded to the Australian War Memorial and archived into the private papers collection. Until I took them out, they'd been undisturbed for 50 years. I'm glad I took them out because they made wonderful reading. Elsie became long-term serving president of the War Widows Association of WA, and together they provided great service to former servicemen and their widows. Victor died at home in 1936. The cause of his death was pulmonary tuberculosis. In an interview in the 1960s, the stepdaughter recalled him having a cough which he attributed to a touch of gas. His TB was accepted as war-caused disability, and the repatriation provided a tombstone in Karrakatta Cemetery. And they're the next two slides that you're seeing up there. His widow moved to an apartment in the city and later to Busselton, where she lived with her daughter. When she died on the 24th of January 1967, her body was transported to Perth, it was cremated, and her ashes were scattered in the Rose Garden. Medal Group: Victor Ketterer was entitled to wear the Military Cross, the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, the Victory Medal with an oak leaf, but the presence of his medal group, the whereabouts of his medal group, is unknown. And I now pass to my conclusion. The story of Victor Ambrose Ketterer is an unusual one. His parents were both born in Europe and countries that were later to collide in the greatest war of all times. They were immigrants. His father died when he was a young boy, and his mother was left with a brood of young children in an age when social welfare was unknown. As a young man, he travelled to Europe and may or may not have developed some German language skills. He enlisted in the AIF at a time when anti-German feeling was rife in the community, but his name did not give him away. At the time of his enlistment, he was substantially below the minimum physical standards, but he managed to sneak in. He gave his mother as his next of kin, but falsified her address. He was truly a first in that he landed on Anzac Cove on Anzac Day. He served throughout the Gallipoli campaign and was medically evacuated 1 week before the withdrawal. While on Gallipoli, Private Ketterer became a corporal and was mentioned in dispatches, and then later he promoted to sergeant. On the Western Front, he was promoted to warrant officer, again mentioned in dispatches, and then commissioned in the field. He subsequently promoted to lieutenant. He fought in the last action on the last day that 16 Battalion fought, and he was awarded a military cross for his actions on that day. When the unit was in its final actions, including his time with the 27th US Infantry Division, he didn't need to be there. He was a 1914 enlistment. He could have taken 1914 leave, and in September of 1918 he could have been on a boat coming home for 90 days leave, which obviously they never returned from. For the remainder of his life, he worked for the good of ex-servicemen and their widows. Victor Ketterer was one of those people who helped mould the first AIF into the institution that it was, as well as being a citizen of note in the first third of the 20th century. Lieutenant Victor and Mrs. Elsie Ketterer laid the foundations for the Australia that we all know in the 21st century. The acknowledgements, I wish to acknowledge the willing assistance of all members of the Ketterer family that I spoke with, and especially Walter Ketterer, who gave greatly of his time and provided two of the photographs that you saw tonight used in this presentation. I also thank my wife Marita, who demonstrated enormous patience as I moved the Victor papers around my study by day and by night. I thank you.